This morning in the second part of our series on living faith in a scary world, and that has different connotations in that title. Living our faith, or finding a faith that's alive. I love that part of our mission statement that talks about giving people a faith that works in real life. That's what we exist, that's what we exist to do. We don't need a faith that gives us 10 rules to live by. We don't need a faith that gives us 10 doctrines to hold ourselves to know whether we are in or out. We need a faith that enables us to confront the real storms in life and not only survive them, but thrive through them. A faith that we can pass on to our children that will help them develop and grow and mature and to live a life in this world where they cope and where their lives are full. It can be a very scary world, so we need a faith that is alive. It's a living faith, and it enables us to live to the fullest, as Jesus tells us in John. Last week we looked at the walking dead, or zombies, and how their bite will make you exactly like them and take life out of you. And how our faith gives us a life that's beyond that and gives us a different narrative from the world. One that enlivens us and makes us vital. And today we're going to talk about one of my favorite characters. It's Frankenstein, but it's not. That's a misnomer, because Frankenstein is actually the doctor who creates this creature. The creature, the monster, is never really given a name, which I think is very revealing. It's called a fiend. It's called a monster. It's called by different names, which really are not very nice, but never given actually a name. And this was written by, the story was actually written by Mary Shelley in 1818. So almost 200 years ago, she wrote this story as an 18-year-old. She was only 18 when she wrote this novel. And she did it in a response to a challenge by Lord Byron and her fiancé, Percy Shelley, were vacationing near Lake Geneva. And because of a volcano, the weather had changed in that summer. It was very cold, and they couldn't really go outside, so they were sheltered inside and limited to just being enclosed. And they were reading and occupying themselves by reading German ghost stories to each other. And Lord Byron gave them, everyone, a challenge to come up with a story that would frighten them. And it was at that point that Mary thought of this particular story, and she shared it. It was later published. And she tells a story about Victor Frankenstein. And so the real point of the story, which we all think is the monster that scares us, which, by the way, whenever the monster was actually portrayed early on. Now, my monster, my Frankenstein, or monster, I should say, was Boris Karloff. Most of us knew more about Boris Karloff. But I thought, really, now what is the deal with this guy? He's about 8 feet tall. I think Young Frankenstein, that movie, Mel Brooks got it right, you know. And he walked like this, right? Very clumsily. And I'm thinking, who can't run away from this guy? I mean, he can't even sneak up on you, can he? Colump. I mean, you kind of get a hint. Something not so good and big is coming my way. You can get away. But in actuality, the story is around Victor Frankenstein, who in a sense is kind of a monster. And in response to the loss of his mother at a very early age, he went into a deep, dark grief. He was already interested in science. And so when he went off to university, he looked for ways to reinvigorate dead corpses, to bring life back. Now, who among us who has gone through the loss of a loved one would not feel the very same thing, wanting to bring that person back, wanting to be alive again, to live and to share life and experiences with? We all can resonate with that. So he goes on to find out a way to revitalize life and dead corpses. And he creates this incredible monster, or what comes to be not so good looking, large, ugly, repulsive. And what happens is, in the story, is that at first glance, the creator, who's Victor, is repulsed. And he abandons the monster. The monster then is left to travel the countryside, and whenever anybody sees him, they're repulsed by him, they run away. He is totally not only abandoned by his creator, he is abandoned by all humanity. Any form of human relationship, companionship. He hides out in kind of a barn area that's connected to a house of a family. And as he listens to them speak to each other, he learns language. And he finds some books that have been cast away by a child going to school. And he begins to learn how to read, and just listening to the family converse. And he can see their interaction and this family loving each other, the relationships that they have. He yearns for it. And he approaches the family first. The father, who has been blinded and can't see him, does not respond to his outward appearance, but befriends him. But when the family actually gets to see who the father is relating to, they are horrified and they all run away. Again, the monster is abandoned. He burns the house down out of his sorrow. He seeks Victor Frankenstein out and says, "You need to make me a companion." And so he sets about and he threatens Victor Frankenstein by saying, "I will take the lives of your family," which he does, and friends from time to time. And he watches Victor as he begins to piece together this woman. But Victor begins to think to himself, well, they're not going to just run off as the monster has promised and be lost someplace in seclusion. At best, she may be more evil than him. I don't know where he got that idea. But at worst, they might reproduce. And then we'll have these creatures running around who are evil. He was frightened. He dismembers his creation, to which the monster responds and takes the life of Victor's fiancée the night before they're married. And Victor runs away, but the monster always follows him wherever he goes. He ends up at the North Pole, because Victor is actually seeking the monster at that point, his own creation, to take him apart and to take his life from him. And his own life dies there. Now, the parallel with our biblical narrative in this story is astounding to me. First of all, when Victor creates his creature, which is the monster, he's repulsed by it. And he moves away, abandons it. But he never gives him a name. When you go to our biblical story of creation, what does God do? Let us make human beings in our likeness. Male and female, God made them in God's likeness. And then God called them Adam, man, and Eve life. They didn't have to wait around to get a name. Their Creator gave them, loved them, gave them a name. And when Victor Frankenstein saw the ugliness of the creature that he had created, he was repulsed. He turns away and he moves and abandons the creation. We are told that the God that we worship, when God saw Adam and Eve turn away to another option in their life, God did not abandon them. God removed them from the paradise in which they lived, but God did not abandon them. God was with them and traveled with them. Now, we have that story later, just a few chapters after that, where God looks at humanity and says, "This is ugliness. I can't take what humanity has become, what my creation." So what does God do? God causes a great flood. God extracts human beings that God considers to be righteous in our biblical story, puts them on an ark with the rest of creation and symbols of the rest of creation, and then provides a new beginning. But what happens? Read that story again in Genesis 6. God saw what God had done, and God said, "I will never do it again." Is it possible for our God to feel remorse? Is it possible for our God to feel regret? And so we have that incredible symbol that we get here in Florida so magnificently in our sky as a sign of that new covenant, don't we? The rainbow. The rainbow is a sign of the new covenant that God will never do that again. And then in the fullness of time, not only does God continue to seek out humanity and to reclaim humanity and to love humanity by sending prophets, by sending messengers, but in the fullness of time, God becomes one with humanity, enters human life in Jesus of Nazareth. Our Creator does not abandon us. As ugly as humanity may be, and we've seen how that happens throughout the ages, have we not? How even today, in today's world, how mean-spirited people can be to one another. God does not give up on us. And so in this story, as we live in this scary world, we are very much aware that we put our faith and trust into God. I loved our gathering song this morning, "God is Not Dead." Because you see, Mary Shelley wrote this book in a time of the Enlightenment, at a time when science was moving up in the world and carving out its place. And the place that science brought was to fight against a religion that was extremely oppressive. A religion that tried to rule and run the world, but really limited human life and experience. And in a reaction to that, a science that then was developed to say, you know what? There is no God. This God that you people are following is fictitious. This God isn't real. In some ways, science was holding up a mirror for the religious institutions, especially the church, and saying, you know, the good that you say you want to do, you don't do. And the God that you present really isn't a loving and gracious and kind God that you purport to serve and worship. It is a scientific reality then that eventually, or spirit I should say, that eventually went on to say there is no God. Friedrich Nietzsche, who was born in 1844 and would have developed based upon this story and the thought and process of that particular day was saying, God is dead. There is no God. And we gather together to say, yes, there is. Because years later now, what we have learned and what science and quantum physics is teaching us is, there is a God. There is something, a substance holding up all of this thing together. And guess what? It's all connected. We're all connected. So in a sense, we're becoming and turning full circle. But what Mary Shelley is trying to tell and say in her book is this isn't the way it's supposed to be. She's not just telling a story. She's telling an important truth that when we play God ourselves, when we leave God out, we are the ones who abandon God. When we take it on our own, when we think that we are the supreme being and we do as we wish, the creation that we come away with is pretty ugly. And it can be very terrifying because we're really not in control any more than Victor Frankenstein was in control of the monster he made or the life that he made, the creature. We are not in control of the creation that we. So she cautions us. She says, be careful not to play God. Because we're not a very good God. Because we turn away and we abandon. Mary Shelley in her life was abandoned. She lost her mother during her childbirth. A woman who was at the forefront of the feminist movement, so to speak, back in the late 1700s. Women's rights. She was abandoned by her fiancé, Percy Shelley, when she became pregnant. They weren't married yet. She gave birth to the child. The child died a few weeks later. Percy Shelley, instead of hanging around and being there for her, ran off with her half-sister for a period of time. She's abandoned. She went home when she was with child to her father to find support and help, and he rejected her. She was abandoned. It makes sense she tells a story about Victor Frankenstein who abandons his creation, turns his back, and about a creature who feels that loss and abandonment, has no name and has no companionship, no company, no fellowship, no friendship, no human warmth. The God that we believe in, though, came into the world in Jesus of Nazareth to infuse this world with life. And in the fullness of time, with his arms stretched out on a cross, looked upon creation, his creation, in all of its ugliness. A creation that had plaited a thorn of crowns and smashed it into his head. A creation that took nails and put it through his wrist and his feet upon a cross. A creation that mocked him and spat upon him and called him all kinds of vile names on the cross. This God that we worship looked upon how ugly we are and can be as humanity and did not abandon us, but said, Father, forgive them. You can only forgive if you love. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And Paul tells us, because of that, there's nothing, my friends, nothing that can ever separate us from the love of God. God will not abandon us. And that's the gospel. And that's what pulls us from the ugliness of our separateness into the light and the love and the community of God's grace.